Introduction. Dulvey, Louisiana, and the weight of what waits in the dark. Let your breathing slow down. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be. Whatever was pressing on you today, whatever noise was filling your mind, whatever tension was living in your shoulders, you can set all of that down. You are safe and comfortable, and all that is being asked of you tonight is that you listen. Tonight, we are going somewhere dark. Not the kind of dark that harms you, but the kind of dark that pulls you inward. The way a good campfire story pulls you close. The way a rainstorm at night makes you grateful for the warmth of wherever you are lying down. We are going to Dulvey, Louisiana. We are going to a place that sits at the edge of a swamp, far from the nearest town, far from the kind of light that makes people feel watched over and safe. Dulvey is a real kind of place, in the sense that places like it exist. The American South has thousands of corners like this, patches of land that never quite made it into the modern world, where the humidity hangs so thick in the summer that the air itself feels alive, where Spanish moss drapes over cypress trees in long gray curtains, where the water in the bayou moves slow and brown and carries things beneath its surface that you would rather not think about. The South is beautiful in this way. It is also unsettling in this way. Both things are true, and they are not in conflict. The Baker estate sits on just such a piece of land. To approach it at night, down the long dirt road that winds through the trees, you would feel the darkness close in around you in a way that city people never quite grow used to. The house itself is large, the kind of large that once meant prosperity, the kind of old money architecture that says this family has been here a long time and intends to be here longer still. There is a main house and a guest house and an old mill building, and further back, deeper into the property, structures that were built for purposes that polite conversation rarely touched on. The whole estate is surrounded by trees and water, hemmed in by the bayou. And from the road it looks like something that was once well kept and has not been for a long time. The grass has grown wild. The paint is peeling in long strips. The windows are dark or broken or covered from the inside with something you cannot quite make out. There is a smell, damp wood, decay, something organic and sweet and deeply wrong, that you would notice the moment you stepped out of a car. And there is a sound, or rather the absence of one, because the usual nighttime chorus of the Louisiana bayou, the frogs, the insects, the distant splash of water, has gone quiet around this property, as though the living things of the swamp have collectively decided to give it a wide berth. This is where our story takes place. This is where, in 2017, a young man named Ethan Winters drove his car down that long dirt road and stepped into a darkness that would change him in ways he did not yet have the language to understand. But before we follow Ethan through that gate, we need to go back, much further back, because the story of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard did not begin in 2017, and it did not begin in Dulvey. It began, in the truest sense, nearly a century earlier, in a small European village, with a woman standing over the grave of the child she had lost, in a grief so total and so consuming that it became the engine for almost everything that followed. The name of that woman was Miranda, and she is the reason that everything you are about to hear was possible. Close your eyes if that helps. Let the images form slowly. We have all night, and the story is worth taking slowly. Section 1. The century that built toward Dulvey, Miranda, the Megamycete, and the birth of Evelyn. To understand why a family in Louisiana was consumed by the parasitic mold. To understand why a young woman named Eveline was engineered in a laboratory and placed aboard a cargo ship with a handler she thought of as a mother. To understand why any of what happened in Dulvey happened at all, you have to go back to 1919, to a remote village in Eastern Europe, and to a loss so profound it redirected the course of a human life entirely. Her name was Miranda. We do not know everything about who she was before. We know she was a woman of significant intelligence, of scientific curiosity, of ambition. We know she was a mother, and we know that in 1919, during the Spanish influenza pandemic, that great and terrible wave of illness that killed more human beings than the First World War had just finished doing, her daughter died. The girl's name was Eva. She was a child, and she was gone, and Miranda was left standing in a village cemetery with a grief that did not diminish with time the way grief is supposed to. Most people who lose someone they love find eventually that the grief changes its shape. It does not leave, not entirely, but it softens at the edges. It becomes something they can carry rather than something that carries them. Miranda did not find this. Miranda's grief stayed hard and sharp and total, and it turned her in a direction that grief sometimes turns brilliant people who cannot accept what they have lost. She began to search for a way to bring Ava back. Now, in 1919, this sounds like the premise of a ghost story, the kind of desperate bargain that ends badly. But Miranda was not making deals with spirits. She was a scientist, or she became one, and what she discovered in the years that followed gave her grief a framework that felt, to her, like genuine hope. Beneath the village, beneath the entire region, threading through the rock and soil for miles in every direction, there existed something that the scientific literature would eventually call the megamycete, a fungal organism of almost incomprehensible scale and complexity. Ancient, enormous, and possessed of properties that should not have been possible. The megamycete generated spores. These spores, under the right conditions and in sufficient concentrations, could infect living organisms, human organisms, and alter them at a fundamental biological level. The alterations were profound. People infected by the megamycete spores developed what researchers would come to call the mold, a web of fungal tissue that threaded through the host's body, rewiring it, rebuilding it, changing what it was capable of. Infected individuals could survive injuries that would have killed an uninfected person. They could regenerate. Their bodies became, in a sense, less fragile. But more than this, and this is the detail that stopped Miranda cold, that made her hands shake when she first understood what she was looking at, the megamycete appeared to store information, memory. It seemed to retain some echo of the people it had consumed, some biological impression of consciousness and identity. The organism was not intelligent, not in any way that would satisfy a philosopher, but it was a record keeper of a kind that no human institution had ever managed to be. The dead, in a very specific and biochemical sense, were not entirely gone. Miranda spent decades studying the megamycete. She built a laboratory in the village. She developed a theology around it, a belief system that cast the organism as something sacred, something that the village's people should revere and, in time, welcome into their bodies. She called the transformation it produced a gift. She called the village her congregation. And underneath all of it, driving all of it, was the project she never stopped working on, the goal that remained constant across decades of research, finding a way to use the megamycete's properties to bring Eva back. What she eventually concluded was this: the megamycete could not simply resurrect a person from stored memory. The process was not that clean. What it required was a host, a living human body that could be prepared, altered, and made ready to receive the imprint of a lost consciousness. A body that had been so thoroughly integrated with the mold that it could, in theory, be rewritten to carry someone else inside it. This conclusion had enormous implications for what Miranda then chose to do. Because if you needed a host, a human body sufficiently compatible with the mold, sufficiently malleable at a biological level, then you needed to either find such a person or create one. And Miranda, after decades of failing to find one, began to consider creation. She was not working in isolation by this point. The years had brought her into contact with other institutions, other researchers, other organizations that moved in the spaces where science and ethics had long since stopped being on speaking terms. One of these was the Connections. The Connections was not a government. It was not a corporation exactly, though it behaved like one. It was a criminal research network, a loose consortium of scientists, black market operators, and power brokers who funded and facilitated biological research that no legitimate institution would have touched. They were interested in bioweapons, in enhancement, in the kinds of biological tools that could be sold to the right buyers for extraordinary sums. They were, in the language of the Resident Evil universe, the kind of organization that had learned to exist in the shadow of larger players like Umbrella, nimble and secretive, and willing to go places that even Umbrella's more reckless divisions had pulled back from. Miranda's research interested the Connections enormously. The mold organism she had been studying had obvious weaponization potential, and the mutations it produced in human hosts were precisely the kind of thing that military buyers paid handsomely for. A working relationship developed, one that was mutually useful and mutually predatory, as such relationships tend to be. The Connections got access to Miranda's findings. Miranda got resources, funding, laboratory infrastructure, and something that she could not have built alone: a program for creating a living host. What emerged from this program, after years of research and dozens of failed attempts, was a child, a girl. She was designated E-001 in the laboratory's records, but she was called Eveline by the people around her. She was engineered, built, at a genetic and biological level, to be the perfect host for the megamycete. Her body was saturated with mold from before she was born. She did not need to be infected the way a normal person would be infected, because she had never been anything other than mold integrated. It was part of her at a cellular level, threaded through her DNA, woven into what she was. The physical consequences of this were significant. Eveline aged rapidly and unpredictably. She looked, at the time of the game's events, like a very old woman. Ancient, small, wizened, but she was, in calendar years, only a few years old. Her body was simultaneously young and catastrophically old, burning through developmental stages at a rate that suggested her lifespan was not going to be long. Whatever she was not going to be it forever. But what Eveline could do was extraordinary. The mold was not merely inside her, she was a source of it. She could generate spores, and she could project them, and she could use them to infect other people. And here is where Eveline's specific horror came into focus. What she wanted, above everything else, was a family. What she wanted was to belong to something, to be loved, to have a mother and a father, and the kind of home that the laboratory had obviously never been. She was a child. Whatever else she was, whatever capabilities she had been engineered to possess, she was psychologically a child, with a child's needs and a child's conception of what love looked like and what family meant. When she infected someone, she did not infect them in the way a disease infects someone. She infected them with a particular purpose, to make them hers. The mold could rewrite behavior, it could suppress personality, it could install new emotional priorities, new imperatives, new versions of what a person thought that they wanted and needed. A person under Eveline's influence would, over time, come to feel that they were part of her family. They would come to feel that protecting her, serving her, caring for her was the most natural thing in the world. Not because they were hypnotized in any dramatic sense, but because the mold had genuinely altered the architecture of their feelings, had reshaped what they valued at a level deeper than conscious choice. The connections had created Eveline as a bioweapon. The idea was that she could be introduced into a target environment, a military base, a government facility, a population center, and her mold would do what no conventional weapon could. It would turn people. It would make them loyal to whoever held Eveline's leash, or loyal to Eveline herself, depending on the level of infection and the degree of control being exercised. She was an infiltration weapon, a loyalty weapon, a thing that could walk into a room and come out owning everyone in it. What the connections had failed to adequately account for was that Eveline was also, underneath all the engineering, a child who wanted love. And children who want love and have not received it do not behave in controlled, predictable ways. By 2014, the connections had Eveline under their management. They had assigned her a handler, a young woman whose job was to travel with Eveline, to maintain her, to administer the compounds that suppressed her more unpredictable behaviors, and to present, for Eveline's psychological benefit, something resembling a parental relationship. This handler's name was Mia Winters, and she was, when she accepted this assignment, a newlywed. Her husband's name was Ethan. He did not know what his wife did for work, not really. He knew she had a job in a private research capacity that took her away sometimes, that involved travel, that she could not talk about in detail. He knew she was smart and capable, and that her work was important to her. He did not know about the connections, or about E-001, or about the small girl with ancient eyes who called Mia her mother. He was about to find out, eventually, in the worst possible way. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before Ethan's story begins in any real sense, there are other people we need to understand. People who were living ordinary lives in Dulvey, Louisiana in the autumn of 2014. People who had a farm and a family and an old estate on the edge of the bayou, and no idea whatsoever that any of this was coming for them. Their name was Baker, and they were, before Eveline came, good people. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night is quiet, and the story is just beginning to open up. We have a long way to go, and it is all worth hearing. End of Section 1. If you are enjoying this story so far, and you find yourself coming back to videos like this one when you need to wind down and let your mind travel somewhere else for a while, it would mean a great deal if you would take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us what brought you here tonight, or just say hello. Knowing that these videos are reaching people and actually helping them rest is the reason we keep making them. And if you have not subscribed yet, please consider doing that now so you never miss a new story when it goes up. Now, let us continue. Section 2. Mia Winters, the connections, and the secret at the heart of a marriage. There are certain kinds of secrets that people keep in relationships. The ordinary, understandable secrets of two people building a life together. The things you do not mention because they belong to a version of yourself that exists before the other person, or because they are simply private, simply yours. These are the secrets that relationships can usually survive, can usually grow around, the way a tree grows around a fence post. And then there are the other kind. The secrets that are not private but dangerous. The secrets that are not about your past but about your present. The secrets that, if the other person knew them, would change what they believed about who they had chosen to be with. Mia Winters was keeping the second kind. To understand Mia, you have to understand where she came from, which is to say, you have to understand the world she operated in, because she had been operating in it for a long time before Ethan ever knew her name. The connections recruited people with particular skill sets, people who were intelligent and adaptable and capable of maintaining a composed exterior, regardless of what was happening underneath. Mia had all of these qualities. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at jobs when they have been doing them long enough that the cognitive distance required no longer feels like effort. Her role within the connections was, at its core, a caretaker role, though that word makes it sound gentler than it was. She was responsible for Evelyn. She traveled with the child, managed her behavioral medications, maintained the illusion of familial warmth that Evelyn's psychological stability required, and reported back to her handlers within the organization. She was, functionally, both a nurse and a minder, keeping Evelyn healthy and keeping her contained, two goals that were frequently in tension, because what kept Evelyn psychologically stable was connection, and what kept her contained was distance. Mia had been doing this work since around 2010. By 2014, when the events aboard the Dulvey tanker occurred, she had been living with this secret for 4 years of marriage. 4 years of coming home to Ethan, or of calling him from wherever she was, or of constructing the kind of plausible half-truths that intelligent people use when they have decided that full truth is not an option. She was protecting him in the way people justify these things to themselves. She was keeping him out of a world that was genuinely dangerous. She was a mother to a bioweapon in human shape, and that was not a thing she could explain over dinner. Whether she had convinced herself that this was sustainable, whether she had a plan for how long it could go on, or whether she had simply stopped thinking about the endpoint, we do not know for certain. What we know is that in October 2014, the connections arranged for Eveline to be transported aboard a cargo ship, and that Mia was among the personnel accompanying the transport. The destination was somewhere in Central America. The operation was meant to be routine, or as routine as moving a living bioweapon ever is. The ship was called the Dulvey, or at least in the game's lore, the events of the shipwreck are connected to the Dulvey tanker, and what happened aboard it was not routine. Evelyn got loose. The precise sequence of events is something we piece together through the videotapes and documents scattered throughout the game, the found footage that Ethan watches, that the player watches, that gradually assembles the truth out of fragments the way memory sometimes reconstructs a traumatic event. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each new detail landing like something you almost already knew. What is clear is this: Evelyn's behavioral suppressants were not sufficient on that day. Whether she chose to overwhelm them, or whether the dosage had been miscalculated, or whether the stress of the transport had pushed her past the threshold the medications were designed to manage, Evelyn got free of whatever constraints the ship had placed on her. And when Evelyn got free of her constraints, she did what she had always wanted to do. She began to create a family. The mold spread through the ship. The crew and the research personnel aboard began to be infected, began the process of transformation that turned ordinary human beings into the molded, those gray, fungal, barely human things that Ethan would encounter throughout the Baker estate, the remnants of people that the mold had consumed so completely that there was very little person left in them. The ship became a horror, and Mia, at the center of it, faced a choice that the game depicts in fragmentary fashion, but the player understands in full whether to try to contain Eveline, to try to reach her, or simply to try to survive. There is a videotape. You find it early in the game. It shows Mia aboard the ship, navigating through the chaos of the infection, and it shows you the first real face-to-face encounter between Mia as herself and Eveline as she really is. Eveline, in this encounter, is not the terrifying old woman that Ethan will find at the end of the game. She is a child, a girl. She looks at Mia with eyes that want something that no laboratory has ever been able to give her. And she asks, in the way children ask things that are not really questions, why Mia will not just be her mother. Really. Not the way the job required, not the managed warmth of a handler maintaining a subject. Actually, Mia, to whatever degree she had kept herself emotionally detached from Eveline throughout the years of their association, was not entirely detached. You cannot spend 4 years being the primary caregiver for a child, even a child who is also a weapon, even a child whose psychological needs express themselves in catastrophic and lethal ways, without developing something. Something that is not quite love, perhaps, but that is not nothing either. She had tried to be good to Eveline within the constraints of the assignment. She had tried. And now the assignment had come apart, and the ship was full of mold, and the child she had been trying to care for was looking at her with those ancient eyes and asking why it had never been real. What happened next resulted in the ship running aground on the Louisiana coast. The tanker ended up stuck in the marshland near Dolby, a beached hulk that would sit there for years, slowly rusting, slowly being consumed by the bayou vegetation that crept up around it. Mia was found, or found herself, on the shore near the Baker property. Eveline was with her, and Eveline, exercising the particular power she had over the mold and over the people the mold inhabited, reached out to the nearest human beings she could find, the Bakers. Mia was infected on or around the time of the shipwreck. She survived, in the altered sense that mold-infected individuals survived. Her body became something that could take damage that should be lethal and keep moving, that could regenerate, that was no longer operating on the same biological rules that the rest of the world ran on. She was found eventually, months after the initial infection, and she would have no clear memory of the period between. The mold is not kind to memory. It takes what it needs and leaves gaps. What Ethan knew 3 years later, in 2017, was that his wife had gone missing, that the last contact he had received from her was a message, sent from somewhere with no clear return address, telling him that she was alive, that she needed help, that she was at an address in Dolby, Louisiana. And that was enough. That was all Ethan Winters needed to get in his car and drive south and turn down that long dirt road in the dark. He was not equipped for what he was driving toward. He was not a soldier, not a trained operative, not someone with any particular experience in survival situations. He was a man who loved his wife and who had spent 3 years in a state of suspended grief, not knowing if she was alive, not knowing what had happened, not knowing how to move forward without her or with her. The message that she was alive was the first solid thing he had been able to hold on to in 3 years, and he held on to it with both hands, and it pulled him south, and it pulled him through that gate and into the dark. We should talk about Ethan Winters for a moment, because he is the perspective through which we experience everything in this story, and he deserves more consideration than the game itself sometimes gives him in its early sections. Ethan is not a protagonist in the mold, if you will forgive the word, of the typical action hero. He does not have a military background. He is not physically exceptional. He has no particular skills that would make him obviously suited to navigating a house full of monsters and family members who have been turned into something no longer quite human. What Ethan has is stubbornness and love. These are not small things. They are not exciting things in the cinematic sense, but they are the things that actually carry a person through situations that should be unsurvivable. Ethan is the kind of person who, when he has decided something matters, does not stop. He does not calculate the odds and conclude that they are unfavorable. He does not have the particular kind of pragmatic intelligence that would tell him, at several points in the game, that the smart move would be to leave. He just keeps going. For Mia, because she is in there somewhere, and because 3 years of not knowing is a thing he cannot continue to endure. This quality, this particular stubbornness, is what makes Ethan work as a character, in spite of his seeming ordinariness. He is ordinary in the ways that matter least in action narratives, and extraordinary in the ways that matter most in actual human experience. His love for Mia is not a plot device. It is the weight-bearing wall of his personality. Everything else in his characterization hangs off it. He did not know, driving into Dulvey, that the man he would soon encounter had already died once in a way that should have been final. He did not know that the property he was about to walk onto had been sealed off from the outside world for 3 years, that the family living there had not had any contact with the outside world they could freely choose, that the infection that had taken them had been total and comprehensive, and had left very little of who they used to be operating at the surface level. He did not know, most significantly, that he was already infected, that the moment he had opened his car door and breathed the Dulvey air, or perhaps before that, in some way he could not have tracked, the mold had already found him, that the story was not going to be the story of a man saving his wife from a terrible situation, that it was going to be something much more complicated, much more deeply sad, and much more personal than a rescue. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. Before we follow Ethan into the guest house, we need to spend time with the Bakers, because they are not monsters, not at their origin, not in the truth of what they were before Evelyn arrived and remade them. They were people, and their story deserves to be told with the care that people deserve. Section 3. The Baker family, the decent people who lived on Serenity Road. There is a specific kind of American family that the Baker family represents, and it is worth taking a moment to understand what that means before we talk about Jack and Marguerite and Lucas and Zoe and the lives they led before October 2014. Because context is everything. The horror of the Baker family's situation, of what was done to them, of what they became, only fully registers when you understand what was taken from them. And what was taken from them was genuinely good. Jack Baker was a veteran. He had served. The details are not exhaustive in the game's lore, but the posture is clear. The way he carries himself, even in his infected state, suggests a man who was shaped by military service, who came home and built a civilian life with the discipline and the rootedness that such service sometimes produces. He married Marguerite. They bought the estate on what the local community knew as Serenity Road, a name that functions in retrospect as one of the cruelest ironies in the game's geography. They had children. They farmed. They maintained the property. Jack was, by all available evidence, a community figure in the way that certain men in rural southern communities become community figures. Known, respected, involved. He had a handshake and a willingness to help a neighbor, and the kind of easy authority that comes from being comfortable in your own life. He was not a complicated man in the way that novels make characters complicated. He was a man who knew what he valued and organized his life around it, and what he valued was family, land, and the respect of people he respected. Marguerite was the beating heart of the domestic life of the estate. This is not a diminishment. The domestic life of a working farm estate is an enormous undertaking, and Marguerite ran it with the kind of competence that never gets the recognition it deserves, because it is continuous and invisible, and only noticed in its absence. She cooked, she maintained the house, she knew the property, every corner of it, in the intimate way that people know places they have lived in for decades. She had her faith and her routines and her particular sensibility about how a home should be kept and how guests should be treated. The cooking becomes, later, a source of horror. The meals she prepares in her infected state, the things she puts in them, the way the domestic ritual of hospitality has been warped by the mold into something that serves Evelyn's imperatives rather than any recognizable human norm. But before that, the cooking was just cooking, just a woman who was good at feeding people and took some satisfaction in being good at it. Lucas Baker was their son, and Lucas is the most complicated member of the family, the one whose story does not resolve into simple sympathy the way Jack's and Marguerite's do. Lucas was, before his infection, already a difficult person. The game's documents and environmental storytelling suggest a young man of significant intelligence and very limited impulse control, someone who had always found ways to use his cleverness in service of cruelty, who had the particular combination of smarts and social disconnection that tends to express itself in unkind ways. There are hints of a troubled history, of incidents at school, of a relationship with his parents that was complicated by his behavior. of a baseline personality that was already edging toward the kind of person no one is entirely comfortable having around. His infection by the mold, and the subsequent separate arrangement he made with the connections, take whatever was difficult about Lucas before, and give it resources and remove whatever small remaining restraints his social context had placed on it. But we will come to Lucas in his own section, because his arc is a specific and important one. Zoe Baker was their daughter, and Zoe is perhaps the most straightforwardly sympathetic figure in the entire game, which is saying something given the competition. Zoe was, at the time of the infection, a young woman with plans. The game does not detail them extensively, but she is clearly someone who had things she wanted to do, places she wanted to go, a life she was building that extended beyond the Baker estate. She had a phone. She communicated with the outside world. She had the ordinary forward momentum of a young person who has not yet arrived at the life they are building, but can see it from where they are standing. She was partially resistant to the mold, in ways that the game's scientists and lore documents describe, but do not fully explain. Her infection did not complete in the way it completed for her parents. She was not transformed into the aggressive, mold-controlled figure that Jack and Marguerite became. She retained herself, her memories, her personality, her understanding of what had happened to her family, and her desire to undo it. She was trapped, partially infected, on an estate she could not leave, watching her parents be consumed, watching her brother collaborate with the people who had caused all of this, unable to contact help or to fix any of it. For 3 years, she tried. She researched the mold. She gathered the materials needed for a serum that might cure infection. She monitored communications. She was the reason that Ethan received any help at all during his time on the property. The voice on the radio, the guidance, the small acts of assistance that kept him alive and moving forward. She was doing what she could. It was not very much, given the constraints, but she did not stop. And then there was Andre Baker, Jack's brother, a figure who appears tangentially in the lore, connected to the extended events of the End of Zoe DLC that we will cover fully in a later section. The broader Baker family, in other words, extended beyond the immediate household, out into the surrounding community, in the way that old Southern families extend, cousins and relatives, and people who knew the name and the land. Before October 10th, 2014, the Baker estate was a place where a family lived. People came and went. There were meals and conversations and the ordinary textures of days passing, seasons turning, the rhythms of a rural life on good land in the American South. The estate had its history. There were stories in the walls, the way old properties accumulate stories, the way a house that has been in a family for generations becomes a kind of archive of all the living that has happened inside it. This is what needs to be held in mind as we move into what happens next. The horror of the Baker family's transformation is not abstract. It is the horror of something good being destroyed, of something real and human and valuable being overwritten by a parasitic entity that wanted love so badly it had learned to forcibly install it. Evelyn did not hate the Bakers. She loved them, in the only way she was capable of loving anyone, completely and unconditionally, and with utter disregard for what they wanted or who they were. She wanted them to be her family. And she made them her family, and the people who had once lived on Serenity Road went away. What remained was something that wore their faces, something that still moved through the rooms of the house and performed the rituals of family life, the meals, the maintenance, the care for the property, but that did so in service of Evelyn rather than in service of the people they had been. The house became a trap. The family became its guardians. And anyone who wandered onto the property in the years that followed was either infected and added to the household or was disposed of in ways that the mold-directed mind of Jack Baker had become capable of. Many people had wandered onto the property. Very few had left. Let us talk about the night it all changed. October 10th, 2014. The night that Eveline and Mia arrived at the Baker estate, and the night that the Baker family ceased to be. Section 4. The night everything ended. October 10th, 2014, and the Daughter's Tape. The Daughter's Tape is one of the most emotionally devastating pieces of storytelling in Resident Evil 7, and it is worth spending real time with it, because it does something that the main game's forward-driving horror narrative does not have space to do. It shows you the before. It puts you inside the Baker house on the last night that it was still a home, and it makes you watch as that changes, And by the time it is over, you understand something about the tragedy at the center of this story that changes the texture of everything else. The tape is found during the game and played back in the VHS style, found footage format that the game uses throughout to deliver backstory. When Ethan plays a tape, you experience it from a first-person perspective, but it is not Ethan's perspective. It is the perspective of whoever held the camera or was present in that moment. The daughter's tape puts you in Zoe's perspective. You are Zoe Baker on the night of October 10th, 2014, and you are watching your family die without knowing yet that that is what is happening. The evening begins with a storm. The Louisiana coast gets serious weather, and that night there is a bad one coming in. The kind of low-pressure system that makes the bayou feel even more closed in than usual, that makes the trees bend and the Spanish moss whip sideways, and the water in the nearby channels churn. The Baker house is buttoned up against the weather. The family is inside. 2 people are brought to the door, a woman and a child. They are wet and bedraggled and clearly in distress, clearly survivors of something, though the exact nature of what they have survived is not immediately apparent. The woman gives her name as Mia. The child is Eveline. They need shelter from the storm. Jack Baker, being the kind of man he was, let them in. This is the pivot point of everything. This single act of decency, a man seeing 2 people in distress on a bad night and opening his door, is the mechanism through which 3 years of horror and the deaths of dozens of people and the destruction of a family and the entire sequence of events that Ethan Winters will survive is set in motion. The Resident Evil games have always had an interest in the way that institutional evil operates through the cooperation of ordinary people, usually unwitting, usually just doing what seems reasonable in the moment. Jack Baker was not naive, he was not foolish, he was just decent. He did what decent people do, and it destroyed everything. The early part of the tape shows the ordinary texture of the Baker household receiving guests. Marguerite feeding people, the domestic warmth of a kitchen being active on a stormy night. Zoe observing the newcomers with the natural curiosity and slight wariness of a young woman assessing strangers in her parents' home. Eveline, for her part, is behaving as a child behaves when she has decided to be charming, quiet, slightly withdrawn in the manner of shy children, looking around the house with eyes that take everything in. What Eveline was doing, while she sat in the Baker kitchen and ate whatever Marguerite put in front of her, was assessing. She was not planning in any sophisticated strategic sense. She was not, remember, an adult, and the mold's intelligence is not the intelligence of a chess player, but she was feeling, and what she was feeling was want. The Baker kitchen, with its warmth and its food smells and its family moving through it, was everything the laboratory had never been. Jack Baker was everything a father was supposed to look like. Marguerite was everything a mother was supposed to be. And whatever Eveline was going to do next, it was going to come from that want, rather than from any calculated decision. At some point in the night, the tape does not show the exact moment, because the tape is Zoe's experience and Zoe was not present for all of it. Eveline infected Jack and Marguerite. We do not know exactly how. The mold can be transmitted through physical contact, through airborne spores in sufficient concentration, possibly through the food that Mia described Eveline as capable of contaminating. By the time Zoe understood that something was wrong, her parents were already changing. What does the beginning of mold infection look like? The game gives us enough to construct a picture. It is not immediate. It is not the dramatic transformation of a movie monster sequence, the kind of thing where you watch a person change in front of you, and the change is unmistakably what it is. It is subtler, a difference in the eyes, a change in what someone prioritizes, in what they respond to, in what seems to matter to them. The affect flattens or tilts. The warmth is still there, or something that looks like warmth, but it is pointed in a direction it was not pointed before. The person is still there, but something has been installed alongside them, something that is slowly taking up more room. By the time the storm had passed and morning was approaching, Jack and Marguerite Baker were no longer entirely themselves. They were still speaking, still moving through the house in recognizable ways. But Eveline was their priority now, in the way that the mold made people prioritize its source. She was the center around which their attention organized. She was the child they needed to protect, to provide for, to make feel at home. Zoe, watching this, understood that something was deeply wrong. She did not understand the full picture. She did not yet know about the mold, about Eveline's nature, about the connections and the ship, and all of the institutional machinery that had brought this child to her parents' door. She knew that her parents were behaving strangely, that something in the house had changed overnight, that the woman and the child her father had let in were connected to this change in a way that was not innocent. She tried to call for help. The tape shows this. The mounting panic of someone who understands that something is happening and cannot get anyone to believe her, cannot get anyone to understand the urgency, is watching the window for action close as the infection progresses in the people around her. Her phone calls do not connect, or connect to people who cannot help, or are intercepted in ways that the mold network around Eveline is capable of managing. And then the tape ends, or rather the section of it that we experience ends, and we are back in the present of the game, as Ethan. And we understand something that the game's forward narrative had not yet made fully clear. The Bakers were not always monsters. They were, on October 9th, 2014, a family living their life. They were good people. And a child who had never been given what she needed, who had been built to want something she was not designed to receive, had taken everything from them. This is what the found footage format does so well, and why the daughter's tape is worth lingering on. It does not let you stay at a safe analytical distance from the Baker family's tragedy. It puts you inside it. It makes you feel the last night of their ordinary life, as a lived experience rather than a backstory summary. And it makes the horror that follows, the horror of encountering Jack Baker in the present of the game, the horror of what Marguerite has become, the horror of what has been done to this household, carry an emotional weight that it would not carry if you did not have this. Zoe survived the immediate period of infection by virtue of her partial resistance and by staying out of the way, by making herself small and observant, and by beginning, in the weeks and months that followed, to work on a solution. Mia, who had been infected on the ship and arrived at the Baker property already partially transformed, went through her own process of consolidation, her infection deepening and her memories of the period before becoming fragmented and unreliable. The Baker property sealed itself off from the world, not through any dramatic announcement, but through the gradual accumulation of behaviors that made neighbors stop visiting and authorities stop following up. Aggressive responses to outsiders, missing persons who had come onto the property and not come off it, a reputation that hardened, over time, into something that kept even the curious away. For 3 years, this is how things stood. Evelyn, somewhere in the house or the grounds, aging rapidly toward the withered figure that Ethan would eventually find. Jack and Marguerite, her loving and violent guardians. Lucas, infected but separate, pursuing his own arrangements. Zoe, partially protected, working in the margins. And the estate, growing darker and more overgrown and more consumed by the mold that Evelyn's presence generated. A house that was becoming a living thing, threaded with fungal growth, rearranged by the biology of what had taken up residence in it. Into all of this, on a night in 2017, came Ethan Winters, driving south, following a message from his wife, not knowing what he was driving into. Let us follow him. Section 5. Ethan arrives, the guest house, the death he did not know about, and welcome to the family. The opening of Resident Evil 7 is one of the most effective pieces of slow burn dread in the series' history, and it is worth moving through it carefully because the craft of it teaches you something about how the game intends for you to experience everything that follows. There is no action at first. There is no jump scare, no monster, no exploding laboratory. There is just a car pulling off a road in the dark, a man walking through a gate, and the particular quality of silence that the Louisiana bayou has at night when something has frightened away all the things that usually make noise. Ethan parks outside the Baker estate and enters on foot. The environment design does the work here. The overgrown path, the darkness, the humidity-heavy air that the game suggests through its palette of greens and grays and yellows, the way the Spanish moss hangs like curtains across the path. The main house is visible at the end of the approach, and it is wrong in the way that the game intends you to feel before you can articulate why. Not dramatically wrong, not covered in obvious blood or surrounded by monsters, just wrong in the specific way of a place that should have the signs of habitation, lights, sounds, the smell of cooking or heat, and does not. He finds the guest house first. The guest house is a separate structure on the Baker property, older than the main house, or at least built differently, and it is where Mia has been held, or has been living, or has been existing in the particular gray zone between imprisonment and habitation that mold-infected people occupy on the estate. When Ethan enters it, the guest house is empty, in the sense of having no obvious inhabitants, but full in the sense of being saturated with signs of recent habitation, food, furniture, evidence of someone living here for years in conditions that are not quite right. He finds Mia in the basement. She is behind a locked door in a cage-like structure, the kind of containment that suggests whoever put her there was either trying to keep her in or trying to keep something else from getting to her, or possibly both. She recognizes Ethan. She is, in this moment, still Mia in some meaningful sense. The infection has not fully consumed whoever she was, at least not permanently, though it operates in waves. She tells him they need to leave, that the people in the main house are dangerous, that he should not have come. There is an urgency in her that Ethan reads as fear, and it is fear, but it is also something more specific. She knows things about what is in the main house that he does not, and she knows things about herself that she has not told him and cannot easily explain. She is trying to get him out before the situation collapses around them. It collapses anyway. The mold infection reasserts itself. Mia's stability is not permanent, and in the confined space of the guest house basement, with Ethan present and the particular stresses of the reunion pushing against whatever equilibrium she had been maintaining, something gives. She attacks him, not as herself, as something that the mold has made of her in this moment, something that has her face and her voice, but is operating on Evelyn's imperatives rather than her own. The attack is terrifying, in the way that attacks from people you love are always more terrifying than attacks from strangers, because the wrongness of it is doubled, both the physical danger and the specific horror of the relationship being the vehicle for harm. Ethan survives the attack. He survives, specifically, an injury that should not be survivable. Mia, in her infected state, cuts off his hand with a circular saw. This is the first major injury of the game, and the game handles it in a way that is both visceral and deeply strange. Ethan reattaches his own hand with a medical stapler and some kind of fluid, and while the game frames this as a survival mechanic, as something you just do and move on from, it is planting a seed that will not fully sprout until a later game entirely. The reason Ethan can survive this, the reason his body responds to catastrophic injury with regeneration rather than shock and blood loss and death, is that he is already infected. The mold is in him. It has been in him from the beginning, from the moment he entered the property, or perhaps from before, or perhaps from the instant he encountered the mold-saturated environment of the guest house. His body is already operating on the biological rules of the infected, which means it heals at a rate that no uninfected human body could manage. He does not know this. He will not know this for a very long time. He attributes his survival to luck and adrenaline and the particular human capacity for continuing to function in crisis situations that the body's shock response makes possible. Mia eventually comes back to herself, in the limited way that infected individuals come back to themselves in this game. She is distressed by what she has done, and she tries again to communicate the urgency of leaving, and the situation continues to deteriorate around them. And ultimately, the guest house catches fire, or is set alight in the course of the chaos. Ethan escapes the burning structure and is then hit by a vehicle, a truck, driven by a large man whose identity he does not yet know, but who we understand to be Jack Baker, acting in his capacity as the estate's guardian, responding to the presence of an unauthorized outsider. Ethan wakes up inside the main house, at the dinner table scene. Let us give this the time it deserves, because it is one of the most memorable set pieces in modern horror gaming, and it works for reasons that are worth understanding. When Ethan wakes up, he is seated at a long dinner table. The table is set for a family meal, plates, food, the whole domestic architecture of a shared supper. Around the table are the Bakers, Jack at the head, large and calm in the manners of a man who is comfortable being the most dangerous person in a room. Marguerite along one side, performing the role of hostess with a warmth that does not reach her eyes in any way that Ethan could put his finger on. But that feels wrong in a way that raises every hair on his body. Lucas, across from Ethan, grinning with the specific grin of someone who finds the situation amusing in a way that no one else in the room would agree with. They feed him. They welcome him to the family. Jack tells him, in that flat and genial voice, "Welcome to the family, son." These words, "welcome to the family," will become a refrain throughout the game, the verbal signature of what the mold's infection has done to the Baker's understanding of hospitality. The concept of family has been inflated by Evelyn's need to encompass anyone who comes in contact with the property. Everyone who enters is potential family. Everyone who resists is an obstacle to family. The warmth of the domestic ritual is completely intact. Only the purpose it is serving has been replaced. Ethan is not fooled. Whatever the Bakers are performing here, he understands that he is in danger, and he understands that the version of normalcy being presented to him at this table is a performance. But understanding danger and being in a position to do anything about it are different things, and Ethan is not yet in a position to do anything. He is unarmed, in an unfamiliar space, surrounded by people who are stronger than him in ways he is only beginning to guess at. There is a phone call at the dinner table, a call to someone who represents, in theory, official help, a sheriff, an emergency service, someone from the outside world who would, in an ordinary situation, be the mechanism by which this horror resolves. Jack Baker answers the call. He speaks to whoever is on the line in a voice that is completely normal, completely composed, performing neighborly cordiality with the fluency of someone who has had practice. He reports that everything is fine, that there is no problem. The call ends. And then Jack Baker, still at the table, still wearing the expression of a man having a pleasant family dinner, turns to Ethan and demonstrates, with an economy of violence that is somehow more terrible than any dramatic gesture would have been, that the rules Ethan has been assuming apply do not apply here, that this is not a situation that official help can resolve, that Ethan is on his own. What Jack does, specifically, and how Ethan escapes the table, we will come to in a moment, but the scene as a whole is establishing something about the game's approach to its central horror. The fear in Resident Evil 7 is not primarily the fear of monsters. It is the fear of a home that has been converted into a trap. The fear of domestic warmth being a performance over something deeply wrong. The fear of family as a concept that has been hollowed out and refilled with something that wears its face. These are primal fears, older than jump scares, older than most of the tools the horror genre has developed, and the game reaches for them with a confidence that pays off. Ethan escapes the dinner table through the particular violence of a man who is more durable than anyone realizes, including himself. Jack Baker pursues him through the main house in a sequence that has become iconic for what it establishes about Jack as an obstacle. He is enormous, he is fast in the way that makes no sense for his size, and he cannot be stopped by any normal means. Shooting him, in the early game, is at best a temporary inconvenience. He regenerates, he gets up, he keeps coming. He does this with the same eerie calm that he brought to the dinner table, the same sense of a man doing what needs to be done without any particular emotional investment in the doing of it. He is not angry, he is not sadistic, he is doing what the mold requires of him, which is to bring this outsider back into the fold or remove him from the picture. Ethan, running, hiding, finding weapons and items in the labyrinthine interior of the main house, begins to piece together what this place is. The documents, and Resident Evil 7 is full of documents, notes, and diaries, and official communications scattered throughout the environment, begin to build the picture. The missing persons reports, the records of the estate's slow withdrawal from the community, the logs that trace the progression of infection in the household, and the personal documents. Zoe's notes, Mia's scattered correspondence, the fragments of the lives that were lived here before October 2014 changed everything. He also finds something that most players miss on a first playthrough, or notice but do not fully process until later. Evidence of just how many people have come through this property in the 3 years since the infection. People who came looking for someone, or came out of curiosity, or wandered in by accident. People who, having entered the sphere of the Baker estate, did not leave it. Their fates are suggested rather than shown, and the suggestion is enough. The estate is not just a horror for the Bakers. It has been, for 3 years, a horror for anyone who got too close to it. A black hole in the Louisiana landscape, swallowing light. Ethan is inside it now. He has been inside it since he drove through the gate. And the question the game is beginning to ask, though it will not answer this question until much later, and the answer will be more complicated than the question suggested, is what it will cost him to get out. Take a slow breath. We are deep into the story now. The night is quiet, and you are safe. And the horror we are exploring together is the safe kind. The kind that lives inside a story, that you can close your eyes against. that is here to be experienced in the controlled way that all good horror stories are experienced, with the knowledge that you are on the outside of it, listening. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. We have more to cover, and we will take it at whatever pace feels right. Section 6. The Dinner Table and the Old House. Jack, Marguerite, and the Horror of Infected Love. We need to spend more time with Jack and Marguerite Baker, because they are not just obstacles in Ethan's path through the game. They are the emotional core of a tragedy that the game is trying to tell alongside its survival horror mechanics. And the tragedy only lands if you have spent enough time with them to understand what the mold took from them, and how much of who they were is still visible underneath what they have become. Jack Baker, in the present of the game, is a large man who cannot be stopped by ordinary means. He stalks Ethan through the main house with a patience that is more frightening than rage would be. He does not run at you screaming. He moves through the house as a man moves through his own home, with ownership, with the specific confidence of someone who knows every corner of a space, who knows where all the exits are and how they can be closed. When he speaks to Ethan, which he does occasionally throughout the pursuit sequences, he speaks in a voice that is measured and almost reasonable. He says things about family. He says things about what Ethan is going to become. He says things that, if you stripped the context away and just read them as words, would sound like the things a concerned parent says to a troubled teenager. The context makes them horrifying. The game gives you a glimpse, several times, of the Jack who exists underneath the infection. It is a glimpse only, a crack in the performance, a moment where what was inside the man before the mold comes briefly to the surface. These moments are rare, and they are not comfortable, because what they show you is someone who is suffering. Who knows, on some level, what has been done to him and cannot reach past it, and is trapped in a body and a behavioral pattern that is not of his choosing. Jack Baker is not a villain. He is a man who opened his door on a rainy night and has been paying for it ever since. The final encounter with Jack, deep in the old barn area of the property, gives him a moment of something like lucidity that the game handles with restraint and therefore handles well. It is brief. It is the kind of brief that makes you understand that the person you are seeing could not sustain it, could not hold on to themselves long enough for it to mean anything in practical terms. But it means something in emotional terms. It means that Jack Baker, underneath the mold and the violence and the 3 years of serving Eveline's imperatives, was still in there, was still a person, was still someone who had been a father and a husband and a man who opened his door to strangers in the rain. Marguerite is a different kind of horror, where Jack is presence, physical, unavoidable, something you feel in the air of a room before you see him. Marguerite is environment. The old house, the section of the Baker estate that is her domain, has been transformed by her infection into something that reflects the specific nature of what the mold did to her. Marguerite always took care of the home. She always fed people. She always kept things running. The mold did not replace these imperatives. It twisted them. The old house is full of her presence in the way that a garden is full of a gardener who has been working it for years, every corner touched, every surface bearing the mark of her attention. The difference is what she is tending, the insects, the mold, the dark, damp, organic warmth that the old house has developed, the way a house develops the character of its long-term inhabitant. Marguerite Baker, infected, has become something that nurtures in a direction that has nothing to do with human well-being and everything to do with the particular ecology of the mold. She feeds things. She cares for things. She is, in a horrible way, still domestic, still performing the role of homemaker with complete commitment. The role just now serves a different household than the one that existed before October 2014. Her physical transformation, further into the infection, is more dramatic than Jack's. She becomes something that moves in ways a human body is not supposed to move, that manifests the insect-adjacent qualities of her infection in direct physical form, that is both more and less than what she used to be. The game handles this with the restraint of something that has been thought about carefully. The horror of Marguerite is not just in what she has become, but in the echoes of who she was, the way her domestic language and her domestic warmth persist even as the thing she is applying them to has become unrecognizable. Fighting these versions of Jack and Marguerite is never entirely comfortable, which is by design. The game wants you to feel the tragedy even as you are performing the mechanical actions of survival horror. It wants you to understand that defeating these encounters is not a clean win, that there is loss in it regardless of outcome. Jack and Marguerite Baker are victims of what happened in October 2014, and the fact that they are now dangerous does not change that. It makes it worse. The main house, as Ethan moves through it, continues to yield documents and clues and pieces of the picture. He finds evidence of the people who were here before him, the other visitors who came and did not leave, the records of what happened to them, the way the estate processed them and incorporated them or disposed of them. He finds evidence of Zoe's work, the research she has been doing into the mold, the notes about the serum she has been trying to construct, the locations of the components he will need to gather. He finds the tapes that give him windows into the past, into the history of the place, into the specific events that he is, in the present, living the consequences of. And he begins to understand the architecture of the estate, not just the physical architecture, which is labyrinthine and disorienting in the way of old Southern properties that have been added to and modified over generations, but the functional architecture of what it has become, where Eveline is, how the mold connects the different structures, what the hierarchy of the Baker household looks like in its infected form, what it would take to disrupt it. The information about Evelyn, as it accumulates, is disturbing in a specific way, because the more Ethan learns about what Evelyn is and what she wants, the more the horror in the house around him starts to feel not like the horror of a monster, but the horror of a child. The cruelty and the violence and the confinement and the deaths, all of it is the expression of a thing that wants love, and has never been given the tools to ask for it in any way that does not cause catastrophic harm. Evelyn is not evil in the way that the conventional horror monster is evil. She is not malicious, she is not calculating, she is hurt, and she is powerful, and those two things together have produced a situation that looks, from the outside, like pure malice, but is not. This does not make her less dangerous, it does not make the deaths less real, but it changes the quality of the horror, makes it sadder, somehow, than it would be if she were simply a monster. The game is going somewhere with this, building toward a final encounter that will not feel like triumph in any simple sense. And the work it does in the middle of the story to humanize Eveline, even as Eveline's influence is killing people and destroying lives, is essential to that ending landing the way it does. Meanwhile, outside the main house, deeper into the property, there are other horrors to be encountered, other stories to be picked up, other members of the Baker family to be found in the states they have reached after 3 years of serving their newly installed overlord. Lucas is waiting in the barn, and Lucas is a problem of a different kind. Section 7. Lucas Baker, the barn, and the mind that was already broken. Lucas Baker occupies a particular and uncomfortable position in the story of Resident Evil 7, and that discomfort is, I think, intentional. He complicates the sympathetic reading that the game otherwise extends to the Baker family's tragedy. Jack and Marguerite are victims in a way that is relatively clean. They were good people who had something terrible done to them, and the horror of their present state is inseparable from the understanding of who they were before. Zoe is clearly sympathetic, but Lucas is harder. Lucas was, before his infection, already someone that the game's documents and environmental details paint with a certain darkness. He was intelligent in the way that people are sometimes described as too intelligent for their own good, a phrase that usually means the person in question has not developed the emotional and social skills to accompany their cognitive capabilities, that their intelligence has grown in isolation from their humanity, in a way that produces someone who is clever and unkind. The game does not detail every event of Lucas's pre-infection life, but the picture that emerges is of a young man who used his intelligence to control situations, who found cruelty entertaining, who had the specific personality profile of someone who would, given sufficient resources and freedom from consequences, do things that most people would not do. What the infection did to Lucas was not what it did to Jack and Marguerite. It did not consume him and replace him with something that served Eveline's emotional imperatives. This is because Lucas, at some point early in the infection's progression, made contact with the connections. He reached out to the organization, or they reached out to him, through the network of communications that Evelyn's household maintained, and he made a deal. The deal was this. The connections would give Lucas a serum that suppressed the full progression of his infection, keeping him functional and self-directed rather than subsumed into Evelyn's family construct. In exchange, Lucas would continue to operate on the Baker estate as an apparent member of the household, serving as a source of intelligence for the connections, reporting on Evelyn's development, her behaviors, her capabilities, and the nature of the infection she was generating. He was a spy, in other words, operating inside a family he was nominally a part of, playing the role of infected Baker's son while actually working for the organization that had created the child responsible for destroying his family. The moral architecture of this arrangement is interesting. Lucas had his free will returned to him at a price. He had himself back, or a version of himself, in a situation where having himself back meant watching his parents' ongoing deterioration without the ability to do anything about it. He could not leave the property without risking the exposure of the arrangement. He could not cure his parents without the connections being willing to do so, and the connections had no reason to cure them. The infected Bakers were a useful cover for the observation operation. He was trapped, the way everyone on the Baker estate was trapped, but in a way that gave him enough agency to make his entrapment his own responsibility as well as his victimhood. And Lucas, given freedom and resources in a contained situation, did what the documents suggest he would have done, regardless of any of the circumstances. He built things. The barn complex that Ethan must navigate in the game's middle section is Lucas's domain, and it reflects his personality in the way that Marguerite's old house reflects hers and Jack's main house reflects his. Where Marguerite's space is all dark organic warmth, all the distorted domestic nurturing of a caregiver gone wrong, Lucas's space is something else entirely. It is a trap, a series of traps, a maze of puzzles and contraptions and triggered mechanisms designed with the specific sadistic intelligence of someone who has always found suffering interesting and now has the resources to engineer it with some artistry. People have died in Lucas's barn. The game makes this clear through the evidence left behind in the space, the remnants of people who went through the traps before Ethan, the materials that speak to victims who did not make it, who were not clever enough or fast enough or lucky enough to reach the end of whatever test Lucas had constructed. These were not infected individuals. These were people who had wandered onto the property and been delivered to Lucas as raw material for his entertainments. This is the thing that separates Lucas cleanest from his parents. What was done to Jack and Marguerite was done to them. What Lucas does in the barn is chosen. It is him, expressing what was already there, with the containment removed. The puzzle sequences in Lucas's section of the game are, from a mechanical standpoint, the game's most action film-adjacent content. They are built on the language of trap movies, films where the horror is a series of elaborate constructed hazards that the protagonist must solve or survive, where the antagonist's intelligence and the protagonist's ingenuity are the primary dramatic engine. It is a different register from the creeping dread of the main house or the environmental horror of the old house, and the game earns the shift by making it legible. You are in Lucas's space now, playing Lucas's game, and his personality has shaped this experience in ways that are fundamentally different from the spaces shaped by his parents. Ethan moves through the barn with the same stubborn competence that has characterized his navigation of the entire estate. Not gracefully, not without cost, but persistently, with the particular quality of someone who does not know how to stop, even when stopping would be reasonable. He is looking for the components Zoe told him he needs. He is looking for a way through. He is not particularly interested in understanding Lucas Baker. He is interested in surviving him. What the player does, navigating this space, is accrue more information, more context, more of the picture. By the time Ethan is through Lucas's barn and moving toward the ship, he knows enough of what happened in this place to understand the full scope of the tragedy he is moving through. He knows about Evelyn. He knows about the connections. He knows about the serum. He is approaching the point where the collected information becomes a plan rather than just context, where knowing what happened becomes actionable in a way that knowing what happened in the past usually is not. Lucas, in the present of the main game's events, escapes. He does not have a final confrontation with Ethan during the main narrative. He slips away, operating with the professional evasiveness of someone who has been working for an intelligence-adjacent organization and knows how to not be caught. His story continues in the DLC, specifically in the Not a Hero content, which involves Chris Redfield and the Blue Umbrella operation that arrives at the Baker estate in the game's ending. We will come to that. But Lucas's section of the game does something important beyond its mechanics. It establishes that the tragedy of the Baker estate is not monolithic. It is not a single horror with a single cause. The mold and Evelyn produced a situation, But Lucas's choices within that situation are his own. The game does not excuse him. It contextualizes him. It shows you the circumstances that shaped what he did, the specific pressures and constraints that he operated under. But it does not suggest that the circumstances explain the choices away. Lucas Baker is not a monster because the mold made him one. He is a person who made choices that were monstrous, in circumstances that were bad, but not uniquely determinative. He could have chosen differently. He did not. This moral clarity, deployed in the middle of a story that is otherwise very committed to tragedy and sympathy, is one of the things that makes Resident Evil 7's narrative feel considered rather than automatic. It knows when to offer understanding and when to withhold it. It knows the difference between explaining and excusing, and it trusts the player to hold both things at once. The tragedy of the infected bakers and the accountability of the baker who was not quite as infected as he seemed. Section 8. The wrecked ship, the laboratory, and the truth about Eveline, the ship. The Annabelle, the hulking beached tanker that sits in the Louisiana marshland, slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation and the water. From the land it is a landmark, a thing that has no business being there, a vessel of ocean-going scale sitting in the bayou mud, rust-streaked and massive, the kind of object that becomes a local landmark simply by virtue of its extreme wrongness and context. From up close, boarding it, moving through its corridors and its cargo holds and its research levels, it is something else. A site of forensic horror, a place where you can read, in the physical evidence of the space, the story of what happened here 3 years ago. The ship section of Resident Evil 7 is the game's deepest dive into its backstory, which is fitting because it is also the furthest Ethan travels from the Baker estate and the closest he gets to the institutional reality behind everything that has happened. The ship is where the Connections research was being conducted and transported. The ship is where Eveline was being moved when she got loose. The ship is where Mia's role in the story was most directly expressed, before the crash changed everything. Moving through the ship, Ethan finds evidence in layers. The physical evidence of the disaster, the damage done to the vessel during the outbreak, the signs of the violence that mold-infected individuals are capable of, the state of the crew in whatever form they are now in. The documentary evidence, files, research notes, official communications between the Connections personnel, the kind of institutional paper trail that organizations generate even when they are trying not to, because the machinery of bureaucracy keeps running, even when the operational reality has broken down catastrophically. And the personal evidence, the specific traces of the people who were here, whose lives intersected in this space, whose choices and actions produced the situation that Ethan is now navigating the consequences of. The research documents on the ship are the most explicit statement of what Eveline is and how she was created. They are written in the clinical language of scientific records, which is a genre that horror uses very effectively because clinical language applied to monstrous subjects produces a specific kind of unease. The unease of bureaucracy confronting the unimaginable and filing a report about it. The Connections researchers wrote about Eveline's capabilities, her development, her behavioral profile, her aging process, her emotional instability, in the same tone they would have used for any laboratory subject, and that tone makes everything more disturbing rather than less. What the documents establish in full, Eveline was the most successful product of a long research program into weaponized mold biology. She was created specifically to be a host for the megamycete's properties, a living platform for the mold's infection capabilities, capable of generating and projecting it without the limitations of a natural infection vector. Her ability to selectively infect targets and to influence their behavioral and emotional states was the weapon the Connections had developed and were in the process of deploying. The fact that she was also a child with psychological needs that the organization had categorically failed to address was, in the operational documents, treated as a management problem rather than an ethical crisis. There is a document, a memo, written by a researcher to a superior, that Ethan finds on the ship which describes Eveline's psychological profile with a clinical precision that is chilling precisely because the writer clearly understands, on an analytical level, what Eveline needs and wants, and frames it entirely in terms of behavioral management, rather than in terms of the child's actual well-being. The writer knows that Eveline wants love. The writer knows that Mia's role as a handler parent is psychologically critical to Eveline's stability. The writer recommends various protocols for maintaining the useful fiction of that relationship without allowing it to become genuine in ways that would compromise operational control. It is, in miniature, the whole story of what the connections did to Evelyn. They understood her need and weaponized it rather than addressing it. And in doing so, they produced an entity that was always going to escape their control the moment the management protocols showed any weakness. Mia's presence on the ship is documented here too, and the documents give Ethan, and the player, the full picture of who Mia was professionally in a way that the game has been carefully parceling out. She is not listed as a researcher, she is listed as a subject handler. Her role was custodial and relational rather than scientific. She was selected for the assignment because she had the right profile for the Evelyn management role, the right combination of warmth, reliability, and ability to maintain emotional boundaries under sustained pressure. She did not design Evelyn, she did not create the situation, but she was part of the institutional machinery that produced it, and she had been paid to pretend to be something she was not, to a child who had no other frame of reference for what authentic care looked like. This is obviously complicated. Mia is sympathetic. The game makes her sympathetic throughout, and by the time you have the full picture of her role, the sympathy has not evaporated. But it has nuance now. She was doing a job. The job was not neutral. She was not a monster, but she was not entirely innocent either, in the way that very few people who work for organizations like the Connections are entirely innocent. The ship also contains, in its lower levels, the remains of the crew in their current state. The mold has been here for 3 years, and what it has done to the people who were on board during the outbreak is visible in the things that Ethan encounters in the corridors. The mold-consumed creatures that serve as the game's primary enemy type are thickest here, where the initial infection was concentrated, where the mold has had the longest to work. They are not people anymore in any meaningful sense. They are biological evidence of what mold infection taken to its conclusion produces, something that moves, that responds to stimuli, that has some rudimentary organizational behavior, but that has lost everything that made the person inside a person. Encountering them is awful in the usual horror sense, and also in the more specific sense of knowing, now, what these were before. Ethan navigates through all of this toward the ship's laboratory level, where the Connections conducted their research. The laboratory is where the most critical piece of what he needs is located, the information necessary to complete the serum that Zoe has been trying to build, the final component of the synthesis that requires the institutional knowledge that only the ship's records possess. He finds it. He also finds more than he came for, in the way that searching a space always turns up things you were not looking for. He finds a more complete version of Evelyn's history. He finds the full scope of what the Connections intended for her and what they intended to do when her rapid aging made her no longer deployable. He finds, in the clinical language of the research files, the answer to a question that the game has been building toward. What is Evelyn, ultimately, and what does she want? And what would it mean to give her what she wants, or to deny her of it? The serum that the game builds toward, the one that requires materials from across the estate, the one that Zoe has been piecing together, the one that Ethan has been gathering components for, is a cure. Not in the sense of returning people to who they were before infection, exactly. The mold is too thoroughly integrated for that, in most cases. But it can interrupt the progression, can give an infected person back enough of themselves to function, to choose, to not be entirely at the mercy of Evelyn's emotional imperatives. It is a treatment rather than a reversal. It is not nothing. The question of who gets the dose is the pivotal choice that the game presents when the serum is complete, and we will come to that choice and what it means in the next section. But before that, there is more ship and more truth, and one more encounter that deepens the picture of Mia and of Evelyn and of what was set in motion before any of this reached Louisiana. There is another VHS tape on the ship. It shows a sequence of events from before the outbreak. Mia and Evelyn, in a quieter moment, the kind of moment that the operational context of their relationship occasionally produced, where the performance and the reality of the dynamic came closest to each other. Evelyn is asking Mia, in the oblique way that the game's writing gives her, about what it would mean to be part of a real family. Not a chosen family, not an imposed one, a real one. The kind that has been around long enough to have history and memory and the particular weight of shared time. Mia, in this tape, is trying to maintain the professional boundary that her role requires while responding to a child who is asking the most human question anyone can ask. She gives Evelyn answers that are technically true, but strategically incomplete. Evelyn listens and processes and says something that Mia cannot quite respond to. The scene does not resolve. The tape ends. And you are left with the image of these two people, one of them a woman doing a job that has required her to be something she was not, and one of them a weapon built around a child's need. In a moment that was not operational and not strategic, but was just two people sitting together in the space where the truth was almost being said. That scene does not save anyone. It does not change what happened on the ship. But it adds a layer to the horror that is worth carrying forward, because it suggests that the tragedy was not inevitable in the sense of being written into the nature of things. It was produced by specific choices, institutional and personal, by specific failures of care, by specific moments where something like genuine connection was available, and the people involved were, for one reason or another, not able to reach it. Evelyn wanted a family. She was built around that want. She never stopped wanting it. And the tragedy of Resident Evil 7, at its deepest level, is that no one ever figured out how to give her one in any way that did not destroy something else. Section 9. The final hours, the end of Eveline, and what it cost. The ending of Resident Evil 7. The main game's ending, setting aside the DLC extensions we will cover separately, is built around two choices and their consequences, and the crafting of both is done with a care that earns the emotional weight they carry. The first choice is about the serum. When the serum is complete, when Ethan has gathered all the components and Zoe has synthesized it, there is only one dose. Or rather, there is one dose to spare, given the constraints of the synthesis. Two people on the estate are identified as needing it. Mia, Ethan's wife, who has been infected since the ship, and whose stability in the present of the game is fragile in ways that the main game's events have tested severely. And Zoe Baker, who has spent 3 years partially infected, watching her family be destroyed, working toward a solution that she cannot apply to herself without outside help. Ethan chooses. The game gives you the choice, and the choice is genuine in the sense that both options are emotionally defensible, that neither choice is simply right or simply wrong, that choosing either option involves accepting a loss that matters. If you give the serum to Mia, Zoe does not get it, and Zoe, who has helped Ethan, who has been trapped here longer than anyone, who represents the innocent bystander in this story most fully, is left in her infected state, on the estate, without the cure she needed. If you give the serum to Zoe, Mia does not get it, and Ethan's wife, the person the entire journey has been structured around, the reason he drove to Louisiana at all, remains infected and unstable. The game has a canonical choice, revealed in subsequent lore and in the DLC. But the act of making the player choose, of putting them in the position of triage, of asking them to decide whose suffering takes priority when priority is a zero-sum decision, this is the game doing what great horror often does, which is using its mechanics to make a moral point about the cost of crisis situations. These are not the choices that heroes get to make in action films, where the clever protagonist finds a third option that saves everyone. These are the choices that real crisis situations produce, where resources are finite and time is short, and the wrong answer is not the answer you chose, but the situation that made choosing necessary. Regardless of the choice, Ethan escapes the Baker estate with one of the two women. He heads for the tanker, intending to use the escape routes that the ship, as a vessel, provides. And it is on the tanker, in the final approach, in the area below deck where the mold has concentrated most thickly, where Eveline's influence is strongest, that the game moves toward its final confrontation. Evelyn is in the deepest part of the ship, or rather, what she has become is there, because Eveline's rapid aging has progressed to its final stage. The girl who infected the Baker family in October 2014, who looked like a 7 or 8-year-old child, is no longer visible as such. What Ethan finds is an ancient woman, horribly aged, barely mobile, the mold that comprises her having grown over and through her in ways that have consumed the human form almost entirely. She is enormous, in the way that mold growth at enormous scale is enormous, vast and terrible, and growing and still, underneath all of it, a child who wanted a family. The confrontation with Eveline in her final form is not a conventional boss fight. It is, mechanically, a boss fight. Ethan uses a weapon made from the compound that the E-necrotoxin formula provides, a substance that is lethal to mold biology, to attack the mold mass that Evelyn has become. But the game surrounds the mechanics with something that is not combat, or not only combat, it is an encounter with grief. Evelyn, even in this form, is calling for Mia, is calling for family, is performing, in the distorted way that the mold's intelligence can perform, the longing that has been the engine of every terrible thing she has done. Before Ethan can finish the fight with the standard means available, the situation is complicated by the intervention of a figure who arrives dramatically from outside. Chris Redfield, or someone who appears to be Chris Redfield, though Ethan, not recognizing him, receives him with understandable suspicion. The helicopter, the tactical team, the resources that Chris brings to the endgame of Resident Evil 7 represent the arrival of the institutional world, the outside, the official, the organized, into a situation that has been entirely off the grid for 3 years. Chris Redfield gives Ethan a weapon, specifically the weapon that will actually end the confrontation with Evelyn, a specialized firearm loaded with necrotoxin rounds, engineered specifically for this purpose. It is not subtle, it is not elegant. It is the institutional solution to a problem that has been, up to this point, entirely a personal one, and the transition from personal to institutional is part of what the ending is about. When Ethan fires the weapon and Evelyn is destroyed, the destruction does not feel like a win in the way that defeating the final boss of a horror game typically feels. Because the game has done its work on Evelyn's characterization, has built, over the course of the story, a picture of what she was and why, of the want at her core, and the failure of every institution that touched her to address it rather than exploit it. And the destruction of what she has become does not erase that picture. She wanted a family. She was built to want it. She was given instead a handler and a mission and a succession of people who were responsible for her without being able to care for her in the way she needed. And the ending of her story is a gunshot in a ship's hull, in the dark, with a man she never knew who came here for someone else entirely. There is a moment, brief, and the game handles it with the restraint that all of its best moments are handled with, in which what appears to be a younger version of Evelyn is present, the child she was, or the image of her, in the moment of the destruction. And the image communicates, without dialogue, without any explicit statement, the distance between what she was and what she became and what she might have been, if the circumstances that produced her had been different. If anyone, at any point, had given her what the Bakers gave each other before she arrived, just the ordinary love of people who belong to each other. She did not get that. She is gone. And the Baker estate, with Ethan escaping it, settles into the aftermath of everything that has happened. The mold still present, the infected still present, the property still a dangerous and compromised space. But Ethan is out, with Mia, or with Zoe depending on the choice made, with survival, with whatever version of forward momentum is available after the kind of experience he has just survived. He will not remember this the way a trauma survivor remembers something. The mold will help with that, in the particular way the mold helps with things, smoothing over, filling in, maintaining the functionality that the trauma would otherwise interrupt. He will not know, not until a later story, that he died on this property, that the man Jack Baker stomped on the head in the guest house did not survive that the Ethan Winters who walked out of the Baker estate was something that had been assembled by the mold from the person who walked in. That knowledge is not for this game. This game ends with escape, and with survival, and with whatever can be built from the wreckage. It is enough. For now, it is enough. Section 10. The DLC stories. Banned footage, Not a Hero, and End of Zoe. The downloadable content for Resident Evil 7 expands the story in 3 distinct directions, each of which illuminates a different corner of what happened in Dulvey. The banned footage volumes, Not a Hero, and End of Zoe are not supplementary in the dismissive sense that DLC content is sometimes treated. They are genuine extensions of the story, each doing work that the main game did not have the narrative space or the structural framing to do, and each rewarding in its own way. The banned footage volumes, 2 packs of additional VHS tape experiences, use the game's found footage mechanic to explore events and perspectives that exist outside Ethan's timeline. They are titled in a way that suggests the framing device of forbidden documentation, recordings that exist because someone made them, but that were not meant to survive or circulate. Within the fiction, they are tapes that Clancy Jarvis, a journalist who arrived at the Baker estate as part of a ghost hunting crew in the game's backstory, before Ethan, recorded and that somehow survived him. The Clancy tapes are a deeply uncomfortable set of experiences. Clancy Jarvis came to the Baker estate as part of a small crew investigating the property for a paranormal web series, the kind of thing that has become its own genre in the internet age, the ghost hunt video, the abandoned property exploration, the found footage horror that is staged as genuine amateur investigation. His crew was, naturally, not equipped for what they found. The Baker property in the years of Evelyn's habitation was not paranormally dangerous in the way that ghost hunters prepare for. It was biologically, physically, and structurally dangerous in ways that no amount of night vision equipment and bravery prepares anyone for. The Clancy content, particularly the bedroom tape, in which Clancy is held captive by Marguerite and must navigate an escape attempt across multiple nights while she periodically checks on him, and the Saw-style trap scenario that one of the other banned footage tapes presents, are among the game's most intense experiences from a moment-to-moment horror standpoint. They are also emotionally interesting because Clancy is a more ordinary character than Ethan, in the sense of being even less equipped for this situation, even more clearly out of his depth, even more nakedly human in his terror. He does not have Ethan's stubborn momentum. He does not have the mold's quiet assistance keeping him alive past the point where survival is statistically likely. He has cleverness and desperation and the particular ingenuity that confinement and immediate danger can produce. The daughter's tape, which we covered earlier in this telling, is technically also part of the banned footage content, though it functions more as direct backstory than as the survival horror experience that the Clancy tapes provide. Its inclusion here in the DLC framing rather than the main game is a structural choice that speaks to how the game handles its backstory, parceling it out through found footage rather than cutscene or exposition, trusting the player to piece together the full picture from fragments encountered across different contexts. The bedroom tape is worth describing because it is a masterclass in confined horror. Clancy is held in a room in the Baker house, Marguerite's room, a space that reflects her infected domestic personality in every detail, warm and wrong and saturated with her presence. He is not free to move around the house. He must escape from this one room, using the objects available to him, across a period of time during which Marguerite periodically enters to check on him and bring him food and ensure that he is comfortable in the way that the mold-infected understand comfort. He must be in a position of apparent captivity and docility when she enters, because if she notices that he has been moving around, the punishment is severe. The tension of the bedroom tape is not the tension of action or combat. It is the tension of concealment, of maintaining a performance, of hiding your real activity, of watching the clock and working with what you have, and knowing that the window for each attempt is narrow and the consequences of being caught are terrible. It is a horror of patience, which is a specific and underappreciated variety, and the game deploys it with precision. Not a Hero takes place after the main game's events, following Chris Redfield through the Blue Umbrella operation to clear the remaining infected from the Baker estate, and to pursue Lucas Baker, who has fled into the estate's deeper structures rather than face the tactical response that the professional team represents. This DLC is a different tonal register from the main game, more action-oriented, more in the mode of the later Resident Evil titles that Chris has been associated with, less survival horror, and more tactical thriller. This is appropriate because Chris is a different kind of protagonist than Ethan, and a different kind of person walks through even the same space differently. Chris Redfield has been in this series since the beginning. He has seen things that recalibrate what normal danger looks like. He has survived situations that would destroy most people, has processed losses that most soldiers never experience, has developed the professional resilience of someone who has learned to keep functioning in the absolute worst circumstances because the job requires it. He is not impervious, he is not invulnerable, but he approaches the Baker estate with the assessment of a professional rather than the desperation of a husband, and the difference in approach changes what the same space looks and feels like. The Blue Umbrella, the reorganized remnant of the original Umbrella Corporation, repurposed as a pharmaceutical and biodefense company working ostensibly on the right side of the bioweapons problem, is a morally ambiguous institution, and Not a Hero is careful about this. Umbrella's history is the history of the entire Resident Evil series catastrophes. The name carries enormous weight. The fact that it has been restructured, rebranded, is working with official sanction in this case. None of this erases the history, and Chris knows this. He works with Blue Umbrella because the resources are necessary, and the mission is legitimate, not because he trusts the institution. His relationship to it is the relationship of a professional to a tool he knows the history of. Lucas Baker's final fate comes in Not a Hero. The confrontation with Lucas in the deeper areas of the Baker estate, where he has retreated with the resources and contacts that his arrangement with the connections provided, is the resolution of the arc that the main game deliberately left unresolved. Lucas is not a tragic figure in this encounter. He is not Jack Baker facing death with a moment of recognition. He is someone who made choices, repeatedly, and who faces the consequences of those choices with the same intelligence and absence of empathy that characterized all of them. What happens to Lucas is appropriate in the way that the game's moral architecture needs it to be. The tragedy of the Baker family resolves around him in a way that says something about the limits of sympathy, that the circumstances that produce a person do not fully determine what that person does, that the worst things that happen to us do not entitle us to do the worst things to others. Lucas's end is not a tragedy, it is a consequence. End of Zoe is the DLC that earns the most emotional weight of the three, because it is the story that the main game's triage moment, the serum choice, left unresolved. If the canonical choice in the main game left Zoe without the serum, then End of Zoe picks up her story in the aftermath of that choice. Zoe Baker, still partially infected, still on the estate, still without the cure she needed. And it brings into the story a new character who is among the most memorable supporting figures in the game's extended universe. Joe Baker is Jack Baker's brother. He is, like his brother, a veteran. He is, like his brother, a man shaped by the specific values of rural Southern masculinity, taciturn, physically capable, loyal to family in a way that operates through action rather than declaration. He is also, unlike his brother at the time of the main game, uninfected. He has been living nearby, in the swamp, in the particular self-sufficient way of people who have decided that society offers less than the natural world does, and he has had no contact with the Baker estate in the years since the infection began. When he encounters Zoe, partially transformed, barely herself, and understands the situation, he does what the Bakers apparently do by nature. He acts. He commits to getting Zoe cured. He navigates the infected estate and the surrounding bayou with the specific competence of a man who knows this terrain and is not frightened by physical danger, pursuing the serum that his niece needs through whatever obstacles interpose themselves. Joe Baker fights infected with his bare hands, mostly. The game gives him limited conventional weapons and makes him a primarily hand-to-hand protagonist, which is a tonal and mechanical choice that communicates something about the character without any words being necessary. He is not a clever man, in the way that clever men solve problems with ingenuity and tools. He is a capable man, in the way that capable men solve problems by going through them. He is the kind of person who is magnificent in a crisis because the crisis makes everything simple. There is a thing that needs doing, and he is going to do it. The relationship between Joe and Zoe in End of Zoe is the heart of the content, and it is handled with a tenderness that the main game's momentum did not have space for. Joe's love for his niece is not demonstrative. It is not expressed in speeches or emotional declarations. It is expressed in movement, in him getting up every time he goes down, in him navigating through every obstacle between him and the cure she needs, in him refusing to treat her as anything other than Zoe, even when what is visible of her is mostly mold. He knows who she is underneath the infection, the way family knows things about each other that outsiders cannot access, and he treats her accordingly throughout. The cure, when it comes, is not a magical restoration. It is a treatment, an interruption of the infection's progression, a reclaiming of enough of herself for Zoe to function and to move forward. It is not everything that was lost, but it is something that was preserved, a person who survived when many did not, when the weight of what had happened on this estate had been crushing everything for 3 years. The ending of End of Zoe is quietly devastating in the way that the best moments of the whole game's extended narrative are quietly devastating. It does not promise a full recovery. It does not tie a bow on 3 years of horror. It offers something more honest, a surviving person, and an uncle who loves her, and the possibility of something forward, which is, in the context of everything that has happened in Dulvey, a kind of miracle. Section 11. Legacy, Lore, Bridges to Village, and Why Resident Evil 7 Endures. Resident Evil 7 was released in January 2017, and it represented a significant moment for the series. A reinvention that could have gone badly, but instead went remarkably well, both critically and commercially. The series had spent several entries moving toward a more action-oriented model, producing games that were technically accomplished and that had their own advocates, but that had, for many fans, moved too far from the particular kind of dread that made Resident Evil feel like Resident Evil. The decision to return the camera to first person, to return the scope to a single contained location, to return the primary emotional register to survival horror rather than action, all of this was a gamble, and the gamble paid off. Why did it pay off? The mechanical reasons are well documented. The first-person perspective restored the intimacy and vulnerability that third-person action had partially absorbed. The Baker Estate, as an environment, is one of the best-designed horror spaces in gaming. Layered, interconnected, always revealing more, always giving you new ways to understand spaces you have already been through. The pacing is careful. The resource management is tense. The enemy design, particularly the humanoid molded and the specific horror of the Baker family as antagonists, is some of the series' best. But the reasons that the game has stayed in people's memories, that it is the subject of long analyses and devoted replays, and exactly the kind of extended attention that we are giving it here, are not primarily mechanical. They are narrative and emotional. Resident Evil 7 told a story that cared about its people, not just the protagonist, not just the player character, but the family at the center of it, the child whose suffering caused all of it, the wife whose secrets set it in motion, the daughter who survived by refusing to stop trying. It built a horror out of things that are genuinely horrifying: the corruption of home, the weaponization of love, the institutional indifference to a child's need for belonging. The mold is not an interesting monster because it makes scary enemies. It is an interesting monster because of what it does to the Bakers, because it takes the things that make a family and redirects them, keeps the form while replacing the content, leaves people who love each other in every biological and behavioral sense, but cannot reach each other through the infection that has taken up residence between them. This is the horror that the game is really about, and it is a horror that has no clean resolution, that leaves marks on everyone who survives it. The connection to Resident Evil Village, the 2021 sequel that continues Ethan Winters' story, is where the lore architecture of Resident Evil 7 reveals its full scope. The village reveals things about Ethan that the 7 only suggested: that he died in the guest house when Jack Baker crushed his head, that the Ethan who moved through the Baker estate was already something other than a purely biological human being, that the mold had rebuilt him so thoroughly that he was operating with capabilities that normal humans do not have, that his ability to reattach severed limbs and survive injuries that should be lethal was not extraordinary toughness, but something fundamentally different. The village also reveals Miranda, the woman from the 1919 village, the grieving mother who discovered the Megamycete and built a century of cult and science and family tragedy around it. Miranda, who had been working through the connections and through her own research all this time, who had her own purposes in what happened to the Bakers and to Ethan and to the mold she had been studying for nearly 100 years. Miranda and her 4 lords, the extended village society that she had built as both cover and resource for her ongoing research, all of this is built on the foundation that Resident Evil 7 laid. Ethan's sacrifice in Village, the full circle of a man who is already dead, choosing to give what remains of his biological existence to protect the people he loves, only means what it means because of the journey that began in Dulvey. The love that Ethan had for Mia, that brought him to Louisiana, that drove him through the Baker estate and the ship and all of it. That love is not diminished by knowing that he was already dead when he expressed it. It may even be amplified. He loved his wife enough to drive to Dulvey. He loved his daughter enough to die again, properly this time, in a burning village in Eastern Europe, to give her the chance to grow up. This is the arc. From the man in the car on the dirt road in Louisiana, not knowing what he was driving into, to the man in the burning building choosing to stay so his daughter can leave. From the ordinary stubbornness of someone who will not stop looking for his wife, to the full expression of what that stubbornness was always capable of being. Ethan Winters is not a complicated character in the novelistic sense. He is a simple character in the way that certain emotional truths are simple, clear and direct, and not requiring any sophistication to understand, just requiring the willingness to feel them. The design philosophy behind Resident Evil 7, the choice to go back to horror, to go back to first person, to go back to a single location and a small cast, and the particular dread of being in a place that is trying to keep you, influence the broader survival horror genre in ways that are still visible in the games that have come out since. The found footage mechanic, the use of VHS tapes as both narrative delivery and gameplay mode, the Baker family as antagonists who are terrifying but not unsympathetic. These choices showed other developers that horror does not need scale to be effective, that intimacy is often more frightening than spectacle, that the best monsters are the ones who used to be people. The specific conversation that Resident Evil 7 is participating in with its references and its influences is worth mapping briefly. The obvious debt to James Wan's work, particularly The Conjuring's haunted house language, and the way it turns domestic spaces into sites of dread, is acknowledged in the game's production notes. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre's rural Southern Gothic texture, the way the Baker family's hospitality has gone wrong in a direction that rhymes with Leatherface's family dinners, is less acknowledged but visually unmistakable. The found footage tradition, the Blair Witch Project, Cloverfield, the genre's long history of using the limitation of the recording device to generate dread, is used by the game not just as aesthetic reference, but as structural principle, with the tape sequences genuinely changing the way you understand the space and the story. What the game adds to these influences, what makes it more than a collection of well-executed references, is the institutional critique threaded through the horror. The Connections is not just a convenient villain organization, it is a vehicle for the game's most pointed observation, that institutions, when they treat people as resources rather than as ends in themselves, produce exactly the kind of catastrophic harm that the story documents. Evelyn was not a person to the Connections. She was an asset. She was a platform. She was a product in development. And what they built, in treating her this way, in giving her the shape of need without any of the infrastructure for meeting it, was a weapon aimed at everyone who got close to her, including themselves. This is not an abstraction in the game's world. It is concrete and specific and visible in the ruins of the Baker family, in the deaths that accumulated on the estate, in the ship sitting in the Louisiana mud. Institutional indifference to individual need is dangerous, not in a metaphorical sense, in a physical, irreversible, people are dead sense. Resident Evil 7 makes this point quietly, without ever becoming a lecture, by building its horror out of the specific consequences of that indifference. The mold, as a monster metaphor, works in multiple directions simultaneously, which is the mark of good horror world building. It is an infection, a biological intrusion that takes over the host. It is an emotion, a need for belonging, expressed without appropriate boundaries, consuming the people around it. It is an institution, a networked organism that propagates itself by recruiting the people it needs and discarding the rest. All of these readings are present in the text, held together by the specific design of what the mold does and how it operates, and none of them requires the others to be excluded. The Baker estate, at the end of the game, is not clean. It is not restored. The horror that happened there has happened, and the property retains the marks of it in ways that cannot be fully remediated. This is realistic in a way that horror often is not. The truthfulness that horror can achieve when it is working well, when it is not trying to provide catharsis so much as honest confrontation. Bad things leave marks. People who survive bad things are survivors, not people who were unchanged by what they survived. The Baker estate is a place where something terrible happened, and it will always be that, even after the mold is gone, even after the infected are dealt with, even after the institutional response has cataloged everything and written its reports. Dulvey, Louisiana. A place at the edge of the bayou where a family lived and a child was brought to them and everything changed. The kind of place that exists at the margins of the American South, where the land is old and the water moves slow, and the things that happen there happen in a darkness that the rest of the world does not see. The kind of place where a story like this one could happen, Not because there is anything special about Dulvey, but because the conditions it represents, the isolation and the darkness and the distance from the mechanisms that ordinarily keep things in check, these are conditions that exist in many places. The Bakers could have lived anywhere. Evelyn could have been brought to anyone's door. The specificity of place in Resident Evil 7 is doing something that the best horror uses setting to do. It is saying that this happened here, in this specific corner of the world, with these specific people, and the horror of it is not diminished by its specificity, but deepened by it. It did not happen to an abstraction. It happened to Jack and Marguerite Baker, who had a farm and a family and a good life, and who opened their door one rainy night in October because there were people outside who needed shelter. It happened to Zoe, who had plans and a future and a phone full of conversations with people she would not be able to reach for 3 years. It happened to a child who never had a chance to be what the people around her needed her to be, or to receive what she needed to be able to grow. And it happened, eventually, to Ethan Winters, who drove to Louisiana looking for his wife, and found something that went far deeper than any rescue mission, something that would change the nature of what he was, something that he would only understand at the end of another story, in a village in Eastern Europe, standing in a burning building with a choice to make. He chose well. He chose the way stubborn people in love tend to choose, without calculation, without strategy, with the directness of someone who knows what matters and has always known. The mold is not stronger than love, in the end. It is just older and more patient, and it takes longer to work with than love usually gets. Ethan gave it the time it needed, and the ending of his story, when it came, was the right one. Extended section. The connections, Blue Umbrella, and the institutional web behind Dulvey. The events in Dulvey, Louisiana, did not arise from nothing. They were the product of decades of institutional history, of organizational decisions and research programs, and the particular dynamics of the black market bioweapons world that the Resident Evil universe has been mapping since its beginning. To understand Resident Evil 7 fully, you need to understand the organizations operating behind it, because those organizations and their choices are as responsible for what happened in Dulvey as any individual actor. The Connections was a network rather than a corporation, though the distinction is largely academic in practice. Networks of the kind the Connections represented, loose, distributed, held together by mutual interest rather than formal structure, have certain advantages over conventional organizations. They are harder to dismantle because there is no central node whose destruction takes down the whole. They are harder to prosecute because the diffuse nature of responsibility makes it difficult to assign culpability in the ways that legal systems are designed to handle. They are adaptable because the lack of formal hierarchy allows them to reorganize around problems rather than being frozen by them. The Connections had been operating in the margins of the bioweapons world for years before Evelyn. They were, in the ecosystem of organizations the Resident Evil series depicts, a mid-tier player, not the dominant force that Umbrella had been at its height, not the governmental-scale operations of some of the series' other antagonists, but a significant and sophisticated operation with real capabilities. They funded research, brokered deals, connected buyers and sellers, and maintained the infrastructure of a research network that could operate outside the oversight that legitimate science operated under. Their interest in Miranda's mold research was genuine and commercially rational. The mold organism she had been studying offered capabilities that no synthetic biological agent had achieved: infection vectors that worked through multiple transmission routes, behavioral modification that operated at the neurological level, physical enhancement of hosts that had obvious military and security applications. From the Connections perspective, Miranda was a discovery, a researcher who had been quietly working on the most interesting biological substrate they had ever encountered, who had not had the resources to fully develop it, and who could be convinced to share access in exchange for the funding and infrastructure she needed. The relationship that developed was not equal, despite what Miranda may have believed in its early stages. The Connections extracted from the collaboration what they needed for their commercial purposes: the weaponization angle, the infection mechanisms, the behavioral control research. While Miranda's primary goal, the resurrection of Eva, was treated as a research side project of no commercial interest. The Eveline program was, from the Connections perspective, a product development initiative. From Miranda's perspective, it was a step toward the Resurrection Project. Both were true simultaneously, and neither party was being fully honest with the other about which perspective was primary. The Evelyn Project produced a viable product, a living bioweapon of extraordinary capability, but produced it in a form that the Connection's operational planning had significantly underestimated the difficulty of managing. A bioweapon that is also a child with psychological needs is a qualitatively different management problem than a biological agent, and the Connection's expertise was in the latter rather than the former. The decision to use human handlers like Mia to create the familial simulation that Evelyn's stability seemed to require was a practical solution to a problem they had not anticipated. It was also, in retrospect, a predictable point of failure. The handler relationship was always going to be unstable because it was built on a simulation rather than a reality. Evelyn could tell, on some level, that the care she received was managed and professional rather than genuine and unconditional. Children, even children who have been engineered as bioweapons, even children whose emotional perceptions have been shaped by laboratory conditions, are remarkably sensitive to the quality of the care they receive. They know the difference between being loved and being managed. Evelyn knew, and the knowledge fed the instability that the Connections was trying to prevent. Blue Umbrella's presence at the end of the main game, and its more central role in the Not a Hero DLC, raises its own set of questions. Umbrella Corporation in its original form was, in the Resident Evil universe, the organization most responsible for the catastrophic outbreaks that define the series' history. The Raccoon City incident, the various laboratory disasters, the long history of treating biological weapons research as a commercial opportunity without adequate regard for the consequences. The rebranding as Blue Umbrella, with a white lab coat philosophy, a claim to being on the right side of the bioweapons problem, a working relationship with official government and military organizations, is not a neutral fact. Chris Redfield, working with Blue Umbrella, is a narrative choice that the game makes deliberately, and that subsequent entries in the series continue to reckon with. Chris has spent his career cleaning up after organizations like Umbrella. The idea of working alongside a rebranded version of the same institutional type is uncomfortable in ways that the game does not resolve, cannot resolve, because there is no clean resolution available. Sometimes the resources you need come from sources you are not entirely comfortable with. Sometimes the work requires partnerships that the work's history suggests you should not make. These are the kinds of moral compromises that organizations and individuals who operate in crisis spaces make. And the Resident Evil series, at its most thoughtful, refuses to pretend they are simple. The question of what Blue Umbrella ultimately is, whether the rebranding represents a genuine institutional transformation or is a surface operation covering the same underlying dynamics, is left open in ways that the series continues to explore. What is clear in the context of Resident Evil 7 is that Blue Umbrella's resources and tactical capability are what make the resolution of the Baker Estate situation possible in its final form. Without the helicopter, without Chris, without the necrotoxin weapon, Ethan does not make it through the last confrontation. The institutional world, for all its moral ambiguity, is what provides the means for the story's ending. This is a complicated kind of gratitude to feel. The story earns it anyway. Extended section. Evelyn's psychology and the tragedy of what she wanted to say. Evelyn wanted a family is to state a fact that the game establishes plainly. But it is worth sitting with that fact for longer than the game's forward momentum usually allows, because the specific shape of Evelyn's want, the particular way in which her need for belonging expressed itself, and the particular ways in which it was never adequately addressed, is where the deepest horror and the deepest tragedy of Resident Evil 7 live. Evelyn was created in a laboratory. She was not born in the sense of having parents who anticipated her and welcomed her and organized their lives around her arrival. She was engineered, and the engineering was done with commercial purposes in mind. And from the first moment of her existence, the relationship between her psychological needs and the people responsible for her was mediated by those commercial purposes. She was a product. She was a subject. She was a weapon in development. She was, incidentally, a child. In that order. Children who grow up in conditions that do not meet their needs for attachment, for belonging, for consistent and genuine care, develop in specific ways that developmental psychology has documented extensively. They do not simply lack things. They develop adaptations to the lacking, behavioral and emotional strategies for managing a world that has not provided what it should have provided. These adaptations often look, from the outside, like problems. They often are problems, in the functional sense of producing outcomes that harm the person themselves and the people around them. But they are comprehensible. They make sense given the conditions that produce them. Evelyn's adaptation, her strategy for getting the belonging she needed, was the only strategy available to her given her capabilities. She could not ask for love in any way that did not involve the mold. The mold was her medium of communication, her means of connection, the only tool she had for bridging the gap between herself and the people she wanted to be near. When she looked at the Baker family and felt the want that she had always felt, the mold was how she reached for them. She was not choosing cruelty. She was doing what her engineering and her history had made it possible for her to do, which was to use the thing that was most fundamentally her, the thing that had been given to her instead of a family, to try to make one. The tragedy is that the tool was wrong for the job. The mold could produce compliance, it could produce loyalty, it could produce behavior that looked, from the outside, like love. But it could not produce actual love, because love requires the possibility of refusal. You cannot love someone who has no choice, and you cannot be loved by someone who has no choice. What Evelyn created in the Bakers was not a family. It was a facsimile of one, performed with complete commitment by people whose capacity for real family had been taken away. She made them love her, and in doing so, made it impossible for them to love her, because love made by coercion is not love. She knew this, at some level. The game's documents and the behavioral profile that the ship's research files describe both suggest that Evelyn was aware, in the way that children are aware of things they cannot fully articulate, that what she had was not what she wanted, that the Baker's devotion to her was not the same as what she saw between Jack and Marguerite, or between parent and child when she observed it, in whatever way the confined, laboratory-raised child of the connections observed the world. That the warmth she had manufactured was a copy of something, rather than the thing itself. This awareness did not make her stop. It could not. She did not have access to any other approach. She had been built to do this, and she had been placed in conditions where doing this was the only available expression of the need driving her, and the need was overwhelming and constant and had never been even partially met. She was not capable of stopping. The game's final confrontation, when you encounter the withered, enormous mold mass that Evelyn has become in the deep hull of the ship, has a particular quality of grief that is unusual in the final boss tradition of the action horror genre. You are not defeating a monster in any clean sense. You are ending a long, slow catastrophe that began with a child who was never given what she needed. You are the mechanism by which a tragedy resolves, not the hero who defeats a villain. The resolution is necessary. It is also a loss. There is an argument to be made, and the game invites it, even if it does not make it explicitly, that the real villains of Resident Evil 7 are not the infected Bakers, not even Lucas, not even Eveline. The real villains are the institutions, the connections, for creating Eveline and treating her as a product, Miranda, for providing the research that made her creation possible in the service of a goal that was always about Miranda's grief rather than anyone else's well-being, the general culture of bioweapons research and development that creates the market demand that organizations like the Connections exist to serve. Evelyn is a product of those institutions and their choices. Her harm is real, and her victims are real, and none of that is diminished by tracing the responsibility back further. But tracing it back further matters, because it is how you understand the full scope of the catastrophe and, more practically, how you understand what would need to change to prevent the next one. Extended section. The VHS tapes, found footage horror, and the design of dread. The VHS tape mechanic in Resident Evil 7 is not merely a narrative delivery system. It is a formal choice that reflects something essential about how the game understands horror, memory, and the relationship between the past and the present. It is worth examining closely because the craft of it is part of what makes the game's storytelling distinctive. Found footage as a horror genre has been with us since at least 1980, with the film Cannibal Holocaust making a controversial early claim to the form, and its full flowering came with The Blair Witch Project in 1999, which demonstrated that the limitations of the recording device, the instability, the incompleteness, the recording artifacts, could be horror tools rather than production compromises. The found footage tradition says, you are seeing this because someone made this recording, and the fact that you are seeing it tells you something about what happened to them. Resident Evil 7 uses this tradition in a specific and interesting way because the tapes are not presented as horror in themselves. They are not found footage horror films that Ethan stumbles upon, with the standard genre implication that the person who made them did not survive. They are something more complicated. They are evidence. They are pieces of a forensic picture that Ethan is assembling as he moves through the estate. And when you play them, when you step into the perspective of whoever held the camera or was present in that space, you are doing something that has a different relationship to horror than watching a scary movie has. You are inhabiting the before. You are seeing the estate as it was, and the people in it as they were, at specific moments that are relevant to understanding the present. The Daughter's tape puts you in the moment when everything changed. The Clancy tapes put you in the perspective of someone who came to this place without knowing what it was, and experienced the full terror of finding out. The Mia tapes put you aboard the ship, in the chaos of the outbreak, giving you the information you need to understand who Mia was and what she had done. Each of these perspectives adds to the picture in a way that Ethan's forward-moving present-tense narrative cannot, because the present is always partial. You see what is in front of you, in the moment you are in, with the knowledge you have gathered so far. The tapes give you access to the past in a way that changes the meaning of the present. Having watched the Daughter's tape, the dinner table scene with the Bakers has a different emotional texture than it would have without it. Having watched the Mia tapes, the questions about her role and what happened carry more complexity. The formal choice to use VHS, specifically VHS with its specific visual artifacts, its tracking lines and color distortion, and the particular quality of video recorded on magnetic tape that is older than the recording devices most players have used, is also significant. VHS is a memory format. It is the format of home movies, of events recorded by people who were not professionals, of family footage and birthday parties, and the ordinary visual record of lives as they were lived. The game uses it for horror content, but the format carries the association with domestic intimacy and the passage of time that makes it appropriate for a story about a family and what was done to them. There is something about watching a VHS tape of a horror that happened, watching it in the degraded, slightly unreal quality of magnetic tape, rather than the sharp present-tense clarity of the main game's visual rendering, that adds a layer of distance that is also a layer of sadness. These things happened. They were recorded. The recordings survived. You are watching them now, in the aftermath, trying to understand. The format says, this is the past, and the past is irretrievable, and what you are seeing here is what cannot be changed. The horror of it is over, in the sense that it already happened. The sadness of it is not over, because it happened to people who did not deserve it. The interplay between the tape sequences and the main game's present-tense horror is one of the things that keeps Resident Evil 7 from feeling like a linear experience even on a replay. Each new tape changes the context in which you encounter the things that follow. The estate is always accumulating meaning, always becoming more legible, always revealing new layers of what it is and what happened here. The found footage mechanic is not just a narrative device. It is a model of how understanding actually works, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, the whole picture assembling itself from incompleteness into something you can finally see. Extended section. What happens to the Baker property and the people connected to it? In the aftermath of the main game's events and the DLC's subsequent events, the Baker estate's fate is not clean. Horror stories sometimes end with a restoration, a cleansing, a return to the way things were before, a world set right. Resident Evil 7 does not offer this, because the world the game depicts is not one where restoration is possible in that sense. Things happened on the Baker estate. People died. A family was destroyed. The mold is present in ways that may not be fully remediable through any intervention that 2017 science and Blue Umbrella resources can accomplish. The infected individuals, the molded that have been accumulating on the estate since the initial infection, the remnants of the people who came to the property over 3 years and did not leave, represent a biological cleanup problem of considerable scale. Blue Umbrella's tactical teams, in the Not a Hero DLC, are dealing with this systematically, which is to say with the thoroughness and the attendant emotional blankness that systematic cleaning of biological incidents requires. This is not heroic work. It is necessary work, performed by people who have learned to not think too hard about what they are systematically destroying. The estate itself will presumably need to be either remediated or condemned. The mold has penetrated the structures at a level that makes simple decontamination insufficient. What it would take to make the Baker property habitable again, to remove the biological presence that has colonized every structure on it, is a question that the games world has not fully answered because the games world has moved forward to other concerns. The property may simply be left, sealed off, warning signs posted, another abandoned structure in the Louisiana bayou, growing over with vegetation, slowly returning to the landscape that surrounds it. Mia Winters' fate depends, as we have noted, on the choice made during the main game's climax. In the canonical version of events, she survives. She is taken out of the Baker estate and into the medical care that her prolonged infection and its aftermath require. Her recovery is complicated. The mold's integration with her biology is deep, and the question of how fully any given infected individual can return to a baseline uninfected state is one that the game's science does not resolve clearly. She is not who she was before October 2014, or before the ship, but she is recognizably herself. She is alive. She is with Ethan. Their story continues. It continues into Village, where the consequences of Dulvey play out in ways that neither of them could have anticipated, where the mold's role in Ethan's survival becomes undeniable, where the child they have had together becomes the pivot point of a new catastrophe. The future is not simple. It is not restored, but it is theirs, and they are in it together, and that is more than the game could have promised when it began. Zoe Baker's story, in the canonical End of Zoe resolution, is one of genuine recovery, limited, realistic, the kind of recovery that does not erase what happened, but does not let it be the last word either. She is cured, to the extent that the serum can cure her. She is alive. She has Joe. She has the knowledge, which is both a burden and a kind of closure, of what happened to her family and why. She does not have her parents back. She does not have 3 years of her life back. But she has forward movement, which is what survival eventually reduces to. The capacity to move in a direction that is not the direction of everything that has already happened. Jack and Marguerite Baker are dead. Not as themselves. Whatever remained of them was consumed by the infection long before the game's events resolved. What died in the game's events was the infected version of them, the mold-driven entities that wore their faces. The people who opened their door in October 2014 were gone long before Ethan arrived. This distinction matters in a moral sense, though it does not console in an emotional sense. You cannot mourn someone twice, or rather you can, but the second mourning is for someone who is already gone. Lucas Baker's fate, as we have noted, is concluded in Not a Hero. He does not survive into the post-Dulvey world. He is the only Baker whose story ends without any ambiguity about what he was and what he chose, and the story ends accordingly. The broader community of Dulvey, the neighbors, the official entities that interacted with the Baker estate over the 3 years of the infection, the people who noticed that something was wrong and were either warned off or absorbed, are present in the game as implications rather than characters. The sheriff's office that Jack Baker dealt with over the phone during the dinner table scene is a metonym for all of these, an official presence that was managed and kept at a distance and never allowed to see what was actually happening behind the estate's walls. These people were kept safe by their distance, which is also to say they were kept ignorant, which is also to say the community's ability to notice and respond to what was happening in its midst was defeated by the specific mechanisms of the infection's control. This is not a failure of the community, exactly. It is the kind of failure that isolation produces, the way that bad things can happen in the margins, in the places where official attention is thin and neighbors are far enough apart that the absence of contact can go unremarked for months, for years. The American South has many such margins. The rural spaces where the infrastructure of oversight and connection is attenuated, the places where you can disappear and not be missed for a long time, or where you can be present and very wrong and have the wrongness not reach anyone who could help. Dulvey, Louisiana, is a fiction, but it is a fiction built from real conditions, and the real conditions persist. Outro: A Night in Dulvey and a Story Worth Carrying. You have followed this story all the way through, from 1919 and Miranda standing over Eva's grave, to the Baker kitchen on a rainy night in October, To the guest house and the dinner table, and the old house, and the barn, and the ship, and the final confrontation in the hull of a beached tanker in the Louisiana bayou. You have met Jack Baker, who was a good man who opened his door to the wrong people for the right reasons. You have met Marguerite, who fed everyone who came into her home and kept tending to things even when the things she was tending no longer deserved her care. You have met Zoe, who refused to stop. You have met Lucas, who made his choices. You have met Mia, who kept a secret and paid a price that was more than the secret deserved. You have met Ethan, who drove south in the dark because the person he loved was somewhere in that dark, and who kept going when stopping was the obvious choice. And you have met Eveline, the child who wanted a family, who was built around that want and never given anything else to build on, whose story ends in the way that all stories end when the institutions responsible for them fail catastrophically and completely, not in triumph, not in recovery, not with anyone left who loved her in the way she needed. This is what horror is for when it is working. Not to frighten you, though it does that. Not to excite you, though it does that too. Horror, at its best, is about showing you something that matters by putting it in a form that will not let you look away, by surrounding it with enough dread that you cannot process it from the comfortable analytical distance that protects us from most things we find difficult. Horror wants you to feel something real, even while the thing you are feeling it about is not. Resident Evil 7, at its best, achieved this. The Baker family mattered. What was done to them mattered. What Eveline was and what was done to her mattered. You are somewhere comfortable right now. The night is quiet, or quiet enough. Your body has had a chance to settle and slow down over the course of this story. And the story is done now, and there is nothing more to do but let yourself rest. The lights of the Baker estate are behind us. The bayou has gone quiet. Whatever lives in the dark margins of the Louisiana landscape is keeping its distance. Sleep well. The story will be here when you wake up, if you want it. Stories always are. Thank you for spending this night with us.